Great Migration was different, however, from other immigrant experiences, and this is where it was different. They were different in this way. This is the only time in our country's history when people who were American citizens had to flee or felt they had no other option but to flee the land of their birth and to go to places far, far away, merely to be recognized as the citizens to which they had been born. No other group of Americans has ever had to leave all that they knew for another place within their own country just to be recognized as citizens which they had been born to begin with. This was not a move in the same way that someone might be relocated by their company to go from Cleveland to San Diego. This was not a move or relocation in that way. This was a defection. These people were seeking political asylum within the borders of their own country. These people were defecting a caste system that was so arcane it's almost hard for us to imagine now, even though it was not that long ago. We're talking into the early 1970s. This caste system was in place. This caste system was so arcane that it actually was against the law for a black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. It was so arcane that in courtrooms throughout the South, there was actually a black Bible and an altogether separate white Bible for people to swear to tell the truth on in court. That's how extreme it was. It was essentially the very word of God was segregated. You wonder, how do we segregate the very word of God, and they found a way to do that. I want to say a little bit about that. If you recall, any of you recall reading the book or in the footnotes, I became aware of it only because I was looking through the newspapers of the era to find what was life like for people at that time. And I came across this article in the Raleigh newspaper from the 1940s, and the big headline said Jim Crow Bible, and I looked at it and I was wondering, I thought it was maybe announcing that this was a new law, but actually it wasn't an announcement of a new law. It wasn't being described with any sense of alarm or shame or even announcing of anything new. They were talking about it only because on that particular day there had been a trial in session, and they had to suspend the trial because they could not find the black Bible. Couldn't find the black Bible. So they had the court officers, the sheriff's deputies had to comb the courthouse in order to find the Bible so that they could resume the trial. And I've since been asked, were there different versions of the Bible? You know, King James for one group and the American Standard or something for the other. Same version of the Bible, King James, just they could not touch, people of different races could not touch the same sacred object. Now this book has taken me, as I indicated, all over the country and even beyond. And I find that no matter where I go, my most challenging audiences tend to be, bless their hearts, the young people, meaning, you know, high school students, junior high school students, bless their hearts, as they say in the South. And I found myself trying to explain some of this to some high school students in Hawaii, far, far away from traditional places of the migration, but there were people there who were part of the migration as well. So I was speaking to a high school class there, and I was describing all the things that I've described to you, but I was having a difficult time making this come alive for them, and I recalled an example from the book that I shared with them to try to make it come alive, make it real for them. But before I tell you what this example was, it actually got through to them. I'd like to see if I might get a show of hands from any of you who might have done what I'm about to describe. What I'm about to describe is not against the law. I would never ask anybody to raise your hand or such a thing. But I would like to see if you would share with us, feel comfortable sharing with us, whether or not you've done the following within the last month. How many of you found yourself driving your car? See, it's about driving your car. Driving your car, and you found that you were about to overtake a car in front of you, and so you did the wise and safe thing, which was to pass that person on the road. How many of you have found yourself in the last month passing somebody on the road? Okay, I should see every hand, and if I don't see your hand, you do not drive. You cannot tell me that you have not passed somebody on the Eisenhower or the Dan Ryan. Yes, I live in Chicago, and I know you did not drive on either of those places, or Allen Drive, Kennedy. You did not drive on those places without passing somebody on the road. You probably did it on the way here, truth be told. So it's that common. But had you been African American throughout most of the South, throughout much of the 20th century into the early 1970s, believe it or not, it was against the law and against protocol for a black motorist to pass a white motorist on the road, no matter how slowly that person was going. Now, I would suggest that would be cause for a couple million people to leave just because of that. Because it's almost impossible. It's almost impossible to not do the same thing. It's almost just second nature to pass someone to avoid hitting them. And yet, if you were African American, it was against the law in much of the South for much of the 20th century. I told this to the students in Hawaii, and this got their attention. You know, it's a very good deal getting a driver's license when you're 16, so this got their attention. And they were horrified by the idea of it. They started talking among themselves. I lost total control of the classroom. And there was one boy in the back, he was going on and on. I asked him what it was he was saying. He said, well, I would have honked. And I said, let me start again. Now, if you couldn't pass the people on the road, you couldn't honk to make them go faster either. And so another one raised his hand. He said, well, I would have tailgated. I wouldn't have made any noise, but I would have tailgated to let them know they need to go faster. I said, if you couldn't pass the people on the road, and if you couldn't couldn't honk at them, and you also couldn't tailgate them to make them go faster. In other words, you had to stay in your place. That's what it means to be in a caste system. There's a role, and there are rules for each group based upon what they look like, which caste into which they were born. And so therefore it was not, you couldn't tailgate either, and I told them that. And at that point another student raised his hand. He said, well, I would have left that. And I said, well, that's exactly what 6 million African Americans did, American citizens did, rather than live under the caste system that I've described to you. And so this is the way that it got through to them in ways that are more powerful, because it's hard to believe that this is what human beings would do with other human beings. Now, I want to say a little bit about this caste system and why such a caste system would have been instituted to begin with. Part of it, much of it, has to do with the economy of the South. The South was an economy, a world in which there was a reliance on not just a supply of cheap labor, but an oversupply of cheap labor to work at the will of the land, to plant and to chop, and the biggest job of all, to harvest the cotton and the tobacco and the sugar cane and the rice, which were the lifeblood of the South. And the world didn't change. The world didn't open up for these people who were held in a fixed place until World War I. And that was because during World War I, it was the North that had a labor shortage. The North had a labor shortage. And the North began to try to figure out what to do. Europe was at war, and that meant that immigration from Europe had come to a virtual halt. And that meant that the North, the railroads and the steel mills and the slaughterhouses and the foundries all needed labor at the precise time when labor was short because of the war in Europe. And so what did they do? They looked around for the cheapest labor in the land, and that meant African Americans in the South.